The stagecoach lurched to a violent halt as the horses screamed their terror into the white fury of the blizzard, throwing Caroline Vaughn forward against the rough, wooden seat hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. She pressed a gloved hand to the frosted window and could see nothing but swirling snow that seemed intent on burying the world beneath its cold weight. The driver's voice came muffled through the storm, shouting something she could not make out, and then another voice answered, deeper and calmer, cutting through the wind like a blade through silk. Caroline pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her shoulders and tried to stop the shivering that had started somewhere in Nebraska and had not ceased since. She was 3 weeks into a journey that should have taken 2, delayed by early winter storms that the station master in Salt Lake City had called unseasonable and dangerous. He had advised her to wait until spring, but she had already waited 24 years for something better than the cramped boarding house in Boston, where she had scrubbed floors and dodged the landlord's wandering hands. The advertisement had promised a respectable rancher in need of a wife, a home in Utah Territory, and a chance at a life that belonged to her alone. She had written back immediately, and Vincent Irving had responded with practical letters that spoke of cattle and acreage and a cabin that needed a woman's touch. There had been nothing romantic in his words, but there had been honesty, and that had been enough. The coach door swung open, letting in a blast of snow and freezing air that stole what little warmth remained inside. A man's face appeared, so covered in frost and shadow that Caroline could barely make out his features, only the sharp line of his jaw and eyes that were startlingly blue even in the dim light of the storm. "We cannot go any further tonight," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "The road ahead is buried and the horses are spent. There is a way station about a half-mile back, but we will have to walk it." Caroline tried to answer, but her teeth were chattering too hard to form words. She nodded instead and reached for her carpetbag, the one that held everything she owned in this world. The man's hand closed over hers, stopping her. "Leave it. I will come back for the luggage once you and the other passengers are safe inside." He spoke with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed in emergencies, and Caroline found herself trusting him without question. There were 2 other passengers, an elderly couple from Indiana who clung to each other as they stepped down into snow that came past Caroline's ankles. The man who had opened the door reached up to help her down, and she took his hand, feeling the strength in his grip even through their gloves. Her boots hit the ground and immediately sank, and the cold that wrapped around her legs was so intense it felt like knives cutting through her stockings. "Stay close behind me," the man instructed, raising his voice to be heard over the howling wind. "Do not let go of each other. If someone falls, call out immediately." They formed a chain, the elderly husband behind the blue-eyed stranger, his wife behind him, and Caroline at the rear, gripping the woman's hand so tightly she worried about hurting her. The world became nothing but white and cold in the dark shape of the man ahead, pushing forward through drifts that sometimes rose to his thighs. Caroline lost all sense of time and direction. Her face went numb and her lungs burned with each breath of frozen air. Her legs began to feel heavy and distant, as though they belonged to someone else, and she stumbled more than once, saved only by the elderly woman's grip pulling her forward. Just when Caroline thought she could not take another step, a dark shape loomed out of the blizzard, a low building with a sagging roof and walls that leaned slightly to one side, but which promised shelter from the merciless storm. The man in front pushed open a door that resisted, blocked by a drift of snow, and then they were inside, tumbling into darkness that smelled of old smoke and mice and blessed relief from the wind. Caroline collapsed onto what felt like a wooden floor, her whole body shaking so violently she could not control it. She heard movement around her, the scrape of a match, and then yellow light bloomed as someone lit a lantern hanging from a beam. In its glow, she saw a single room with a stone fireplace, a few chairs with broken backs, and a pile of firewood that looked like it had been sitting there since the previous winter. The blue-eyed man was already at the fireplace, building a fire with swift, practiced movements. The elderly couple huddled together on one of the intact chairs, looking pale and frightened but alive. "Is everyone all right?" the man asked without turning from his work. His voice was steady, betraying no sign of the ordeal they had just survived. "We are well enough," the elderly husband answered. "Thanks to you, young man." Caroline tried to say something, but what came out was not words, just a strange rattling sound that did not seem to belong to her. The man at the fireplace turned sharply, and for the first time she saw his face clearly in the lantern light. He was younger than she had thought, perhaps 28 or 30, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, and those remarkable blue eyes that now studied her with concern. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt beside her, pulling off his gloves to press his bare hand against her forehead. "You are burning up," he said, and there was surprise in his voice, as though fever and blizzards did not belong together in his understanding of the world. "I am cold," Caroline managed to say through chattering teeth. "So cold. When did you start feeling ill?" He was already unwinding the thin scarf from around her neck, his movements gentle but efficient. 2 days ago. Maybe 3. It was hard to remember. The journey had become a blur of stations and strangers and exhaustion that went bone deep. "Just a cough at first. It is nothing." "It is not nothing." He looked over his shoulder at the elderly couple. "Do either of you have medical experience?" They shook their heads, looking helpless and worried. The man turned back to Caroline, his jaw tight with decision. "My name is Vincent Irving. I am a rancher from Circleville, about 20 miles south of here. I was returning from Salt Lake City when the storm caught me. I know something of frontier medicine, enough to see that you have a serious fever and likely pneumonia setting in. We need to get you warm and dry immediately." Caroline stared at him, the words taking a long moment to penetrate the fog in her mind. "Vincent Irving," she repeated. "But you are supposed to meet me in Circleville. I am Caroline Vaughn, your mail-order bride." His eyes widened, genuine shock breaking through his composed exterior for just a moment. Then something else crossed his face, an expression she could not quite read but which might have been concern or possibly fear. "You should have waited," he said quietly. "I wrote to you 3 weeks ago telling you not to come until spring. The winter storms come early here and they are deadly." "I never received that letter." Caroline's voice was fading, exhaustion dragging at every word. "I have been traveling for so long. I just wanted to arrive." Vincent was silent for a moment, then he began removing her wet coat with careful hands. "Well, you have arrived after a fashion, though not in the manner either of us planned. Right now we need to focus on keeping you alive through this fever." The fire was catching now, sending welcome heat into the cold room. Vincent carried Caroline closer to it, settling her on a pile of old blankets he had found in a corner and shaken free of dust. The elderly woman, who introduced herself as Mrs. Winters, came to help remove Caroline's wet boots and stockings, making soft, sympathetic sounds at how cold her feet were. Vincent disappeared outside into the storm, returning minutes later with Caroline's carpet bag and the other luggage, all covered in a thick layer of snow. "I brought the horses into the lean-to around back," he said, brushing snow from his coat. "They will be cold but out of the worst of the wind." The stage driver chose to stay with them. He said he has weathered worse, though I have my doubts about that. Through the night that followed, Caroline drifted in and out of fevered dreams where the cold and heat became the same thing, where she was back in Boston scrubbing floors that stretched on forever, where her mother, who had died when Caroline was 12, stood in the snow calling her name. She was vaguely aware of Vincent's presence, his hand cool on her forehead, his voice low and calm as he spoke to the Winters, explaining what needed to be done. He had found dried herbs in Caroline's bag, remedies she had packed on the advice of a wise woman in Boston, and he made them into bitter tea that he coaxed down her throat spoonful by spoonful. He wrapped her in every dry blanket and coat they had, building the fire high and keeping it fed through the long hours. Sometime deep in the night, when the storm seemed to have reached a crescendo of fury that made the walls shake, Caroline's fever spiked. She thrashed and cried out, caught in nightmares she could not escape. Strong arms gathered her close, and she felt herself lifted against a warm chest, held tight as a voice near her ear spoke words she could not quite make out but which somehow calmed the worst of her panic. She turned her face into that warmth, seeking shelter there the way a drowning person seeks air, and distantly heard Vincent's voice saying, "I have you. You are safe. I will not let go." She believed him, though she did not know why, and finally slipped into a deeper sleep where the dreams could not follow. When Caroline woke, pale gray light was filtering through the cracks in the walls, and the storm had quieted to a steady snowfall instead of a raging blizzard. She was still wrapped in blankets, still lying close to the fire, but she was propped against something solid and warm. Turning her head with effort, she realized she was leaning against Vincent, his back against the wall and one arm around her shoulders, holding her secure. He was asleep, his head tipped back and dark circles under his eyes, his other hand still resting on her forehead as though even in sleep he was monitoring her fever. The Winters were asleep as well, curled together on a pile of blankets on the other side of the fire. The room was quiet except for the crackle of flames and the soft whisper of falling snow outside. Caroline tried to sit up, and the movement woke Vincent immediately. His eyes opened and focused on her with an alertness that suggested he had not been deeply asleep at all. "How do you feel?" he asked, his voice rough with exhaustion. "Weak," Caroline admitted, "but the fever has broken, I think. I am not so cold anymore." Vincent pressed his hand more firmly against her forehead, then her cheek, assessing. "Yes, it has broken. That is a good sign, but you are not out of danger yet. Pneumonia can come back quickly if you do not rest and stay warm." "You stayed awake all night," Caroline said, seeing the evidence of it written clearly on his face. "Someone needed to maintain the fire and watch over you." He said it simply, as though it were the only logical course of action, nothing worth commenting on. "Thank you." The words felt inadequate for what he had done, for quite possibly having saved her life, but they were all she had. Something flickered in his eyes, an emotion too quick to catch. "You are my responsibility now. You came all this way to marry me. The least I can do is make sure you survive the journey." There was a hint of something in his tone, perhaps irony or regret, and Caroline wondered what he thought of this situation, of a mail-order bride who had arrived half-frozen and fevered before they had even properly met. She must seem like a terrible burden, a problem to be solved rather than a partner to be welcomed. The thought brought a sting of tears to her eyes that she blinked away quickly, turning her face so he would not see. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "This is not what you expected when you sent for a wife." Vincent was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had softened. "Life on the frontier rarely goes as expected. I have learned to adapt to circumstances as they come. Right now, the circumstances are that you need to recover your strength, and I need to get you safely to Circleville once this storm passes. We can worry about the rest later." The storm continued through most of that day, though with less violence than the night before. Vincent went out periodically to check on the horses and the stage driver, who had indeed survived the night and was in better spirits than seemed reasonable for a man who had spent the night in a lean-to with livestock. He brought the driver inside to warm up, and the man gratefully accepted hot coffee that Vincent made from supplies in his saddlebags. "Roads will be impassable for at least a day, maybe 2, the driver said. A grizzled man named Tom who had been running stage routes in Utah Territory for 15 years. "Once they clear enough, I will take my passengers on to their destinations, but I would not recommend that anyone travel before then. That was as bad a storm as I have seen this early in the season." Vincent nodded, glancing at Caroline where she lay wrapped in blankets. "Miss Vaughn cannot travel far in her condition regardless. When the road's clear, how far can you take her?" "The stage route runs through Circleville," Tom said. "I can bring her right to your door if that is where she is headed." "It is." Vincent poured more coffee, his expression thoughtful. "But I think I will ride ahead once the weather breaks and send back a wagon for her. It will be more comfortable than the stage." Caroline wanted to protest that she did not need special treatment, that she could manage the stage ride, but in truth she was not sure she could. Even sitting up made her dizzy, and her lungs felt tight and heavy in her chest. The cough that had started days ago had worsened into something deeper and more painful. She tried to hide it, turning her face into the blankets when the coughing fits came, but Vincent noticed everything. He made her drink more of the bitter herb tea, and when she protested that she had already had enough, he simply fixed her with a steady look and said, "Drink it anyway." There was no anger in his voice, no impatience, just calm insistence, and Caroline found herself obeying. There was something reassuring about his certainty, about the way he took control of a situation without being domineering. She had known men who commanded through fear or bluster, but Vincent's authority came from competence and a quiet confidence that made people want to trust him. The Winters fussed over Caroline like concerned grandparents, Mrs. Winters insisting on combing out Caroline's long dark hair that had become tangled during the night, braiding it neatly while telling stories about her own youth in Indiana. Mr. Winters whittled a small bird from a piece of firewood and presented it to Caroline with a grave formality that made her smile despite her exhaustion. They were good people, and their kindness was a balm to Caroline's spirit, which had been bruised by too many years of being treated as nothing more than a servant or a nuisance. By the second night, the storm had passed completely, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Through the cracks in the walls, Caroline could see stars appearing in a clearing sky, impossibly bright and numerous. Vincent sat near the fire, cleaning his rifle with methodical care, and the Winters had already fallen asleep. Caroline watched him work, noting the care he took with each piece of the weapon, the way his hands moved with practiced skill. "Have you been ranching long?" she asked quietly, not wanting to wake the Winters. Vincent looked up, seeming surprised that she was still awake. "All my life. My father settled the land outside Circleville in 1858 when I was 10 years old. He died 6 years ago and left the ranch to me. It must be hard, running it alone. I have 2 hired men who help with the heavy work, and I manage." He reassembled the rifle with smooth efficiency. "But yes, it is hard. A ranch needs a family to truly thrive. That is why I decided to look for a wife." Caroline wanted to ask why he had chosen to send for a mail-order bride rather than court someone locally, but the question seemed too personal for their brief acquaintance. Instead, she said, "Tell me about Circleville. What is it like? Vincent set the rifle aside and leaned back against the wall, his eyes distant as though seeing something beyond the confines of the small room. It is small, maybe 60 families in total, most of them Mormon settlers, though I am not Mormon myself. It sits in a valley with mountains on all sides, beautiful country when it is not trying to kill you with cold or heat. The people are hardworking and decent for the most part, suspicious of outsiders but willing to help a neighbor in need. We are far from everything that most people consider civilization, which means we have to rely on ourselves and each other. It is a hard life, but it is honest, and the land rewards those who are willing to work for it. There was love in his voice when he spoke of the place, a deep attachment that went beyond simple ownership. Caroline found herself wanting to see it through his eyes, this valley that had shaped him into the man he was. "It sounds lonely," she said softly. "It can be." Vincent met her eyes, and in the firelight his expression was unguarded for just a moment. "That is another reason I sent for a wife. A house is just a building without someone to share it with." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meanings that Caroline did not quite know how to interpret. This man who had held her through fever, who had stayed awake to keep her safe, who was her intended husband though they were still strangers to each other. She wondered what kind of marriage they would have, whether it would be merely practical or if there might be room for something more. The thought brought a warmth to her face that had nothing to do with fever. "I hope I will not disappoint you," she said, the words coming out smaller than she intended. Vincent studied her for a long moment, his gaze steady and serious. "You traveled across the country alone to start a new life with a man you had never met. You have survived a blizzard and fever that would have killed weaker people. Whatever else you may be, Caroline Vaughn, you are not a disappointment." The use of her given name, spoken in his low voice, did strange things to her heartbeat. She looked away, suddenly shy, pulling the blankets more tightly around herself. "You barely know me. I might be terrible at ranching. I might burn every meal I cook. Can you cook?" he asked, and there was a hint of amusement in his voice now. "Yes, actually, quite well. I worked in the kitchen of a boarding house for 6 years, and I can sew and keep accounts and tend a garden." She had been determined to learn every useful skill she could, preparing for the day when she might have a home of her own to care for. "Then you are already more qualified than I dared hope for." I was half expecting someone who had never worked a day in her life and thought frontier living would be romantic adventure. Caroline laughed, a sound that turned into coughing that took a minute to subside. When she caught her breath again, she said, "I have no illusions about adventure. I have spent my whole life working hard just to survive. I came west because I wanted something more than survival. I wanted a chance to build something, to belong somewhere. Then we want the same things." Vincent stood and added more wood to the fire, then brought Caroline a cup of water from their dwindling supply. "Get some rest. We will likely be able to travel tomorrow, and you will need your strength." Caroline obeyed, settling back into the blankets, but sleep was slow to come. She found herself thinking about the cabin waiting in Circleville, about what it would be like to be Vincent Irving's wife, about the strange circumstances that had brought them together. She had expected to meet him under normal conditions, to have time to get to know each other before the wedding. But fate had compressed everything into these 2 days in a storm-battered way station, where he had seen her at her most vulnerable, and had responded with a steadiness that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since her mother died. Perhaps, she thought as sleep finally claimed her, perhaps this was not such a bad beginning after all. Morning brought brilliant sunshine that reflected off the snow with blinding intensity, turning the world into a landscape of white and blue and eye-watering brightness. Tom, the stage driver, declared the roads passable with care, and Vincent made the decision that he would ride ahead to Circleville and send back a wagon for Caroline. The Winters would continue on the stage to their destination, a small town another 50 miles south. "Are you certain you will be all right?" Mrs. Winters asked Caroline, clutching her hands with genuine concern. "You still look so pale." "I will be fine," Caroline assured her, though in truth she still felt weak and shaky. "Vincent will send help quickly." Vincent was outside saddling his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that had weathered the storm well. Caroline watched through the window as he worked, efficient even in the deep snow, and felt a pang of anxiety at the thought of him leaving. It was foolish, she told herself. She had managed for years without anyone to depend on. A few hours alone in this way station until the wagon arrived would be nothing. But when Vincent came back inside to say goodbye, she found it harder than expected to watch him prepare to leave. He knelt beside her, checking her forehead one more time for fever, his touch gentle. "The wagon should be here by mid-afternoon," he said. "I am leaving you with food and water and enough firewood to keep the fire going. Do not let it go out. If you start feeling worse, if the fever comes back, send whoever comes with the wagon to fetch the doctor immediately. Do you understand?" "Yes," Caroline managed a smile. "I am not going to die in the few hours you are gone. See that you do not." He said it seriously, without any trace of humor, and Caroline realized he was genuinely worried. The thought warmed something in her chest. "Vincent," she said as he started to stand. He paused, looking down at her with those blue eyes that seemed to see more than most people. "Thank you for everything. I know this is not what you expected when you agreed to marry me. As I said before, life rarely goes as expected." He hesitated, then added quietly, "But sometimes the unexpected turns out better than the plans we made. Rest now. I will see you in Circleville." Then he was gone, and Caroline heard the sound of his horse moving away through the snow, leaving her alone in the silent way station with only the crackling fire for company. The Winters had already departed on the stage, Tom having decided to make the journey while the roads were still clear, and the absence of human voices made the small building feel larger and emptier. Caroline tried to rest as instructed, but worry kept her awake. What if Vincent's horse foundered in the deep snow? What if he was caught by another storm? What if bandits found him traveling alone? She knew these fears were probably irrational, that Vincent clearly knew how to take care of himself in this harsh land, but she could not seem to stop her mind from conjuring disasters. The hours crawled past with agonizing slowness. Caroline fed the fire and ate some of the dried meat and hard biscuits that Vincent had left for her. She tried to read from the small book of poetry she had packed in her bag, but the words swam before her eyes, and she could not concentrate. Her cough was worse, each spasm feeling like it might tear something loose in her chest, and she began to wonder if Vincent had been right to worry about her condition. It was late afternoon, the sun already sinking toward the western mountains, when she heard the sound of wagon wheels and horses approaching. Relief flooded through her as she struggled to her feet, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders and moving to the door. When she opened it, she saw a wagon pulled by 2 horses, and driving it was not Vincent but a younger man, perhaps 21 or 22, with red hair and freckles and a friendly face. "Miss Vaughn," he called out, pulling the horses to a stop. "I am Charlie Morton. I work for Vincent Irving. He sent me to bring you back to Circleville." "Is Vincent all right?" Caroline asked immediately. "Yes, madam, fit as ever. He rode into town about 3 hours ago and came straight to the ranch to get me and the wagon. He would have come himself, but he needed to make arrangements in town for your arrival." Charlie jumped down from the wagon seat and came to help her, his expression turning concerned when he got a closer look at her. Vincent said you had been sick. You still look pretty poorly if you do not mind me saying so. I am well enough to travel, Caroline said, though she was not entirely sure that was true. Let me get my things. Charlie helped her gather her few belongings and lock up the way station as best they could, then lifted her into the wagon seat with an ease that suggested he was stronger than his lanky frame implied. He had brought a pile of blankets and furs, and he tucked them around her with an efficiency that suggested Vincent had given him specific instructions about keeping her warm. The journey to Circleville took nearly 3 hours, the wagon moving slowly through snow that was sometimes deep enough to come over the wheel hubs. Charlie kept up a steady stream of conversation, telling Caroline about the ranch and the town and Vincent, clearly trying to distract her from the cold and the rough ride. She learned that Charlie had been working for Vincent for 2 years, that he considered Vincent the best boss he had ever had, fair and generous and willing to work as hard as any of his hired men. She learned that the ranch ran about 200 head of cattle, and that Vincent was known throughout the valley as someone you could trust, a man of his word. He has been alone out there too long, Charlie said as they descended into a valley where lights were beginning to appear in windows against the gathering dusk. It is not natural for a man to live that isolated. We were all glad when he said he had sent for a bride, though I will admit some folks were skeptical about the whole mail order business. But Vincent said he did not have time to go courting proper, and he needed someone practical who would not faint at the first sight of a branding iron. Caroline had to laugh at that, though it made her cough. I promise not to faint at branding irons. Vincent said you seemed like a sensible woman from your letters, said you had a good head on your shoulders and did not ask for anything unreasonable. That is high praise from him. He does not give compliments lightly. They entered Circleville as full dark was settling over the valley, the snow-covered streets quiet and peaceful. Caroline saw a handful of buildings clustered together, a general store and what looked like a church, and several houses built of wood and stone. Oil lamps glowed in windows, and smoke rose from chimneys into the clear, cold air. It was small and remote and beautiful in its simplicity, and Caroline felt something in her chest ease at the sight of it. Charlie drove through the town and out the other side, following a road that led south through open country, where moonlight reflected off the snow in shades of blue and silver. After another 20 minutes, they turned onto a smaller track, and Caroline saw a house ahead, larger than she had expected. A solid 2-story building with a barn and several outbuildings nearby. Light glowed in the downstairs windows, warm and welcoming, and as they approached, the front door opened and Vincent stepped out onto the porch. He was down the steps before Charlie had fully stopped the wagon, reaching up to help Caroline down with strong hands that steadied her when her legs proved uncooperative. "You look exhausted," he said, his voice rough with concern. "We need to get you inside and warm immediately." "I am all right," Caroline said automatically, but Vincent was already lifting her into his arms, carrying her toward the house as though she weighed nothing at all. "You are not all right. You should not have had to travel in your condition, but there was no help for it." He shouldered open the door and carried her inside, and Caroline had a brief impression of a large room with a stone fireplace and simple but sturdy furniture, before Vincent was climbing stairs and carrying her into a bedroom where a fire burned cheerfully in a smaller hearth. He set her down carefully on a large bed, covered with a colorful quilt, then began removing her snow-damp coat and boots. His movements were impersonal and efficient, focused on the practical necessity of getting her warm and dry. But Caroline felt her face heating anyway at the intimacy of having him tend to her this way. "There are clean nightclothes in the wardrobe," Vincent said, gesturing to a large wooden piece of furniture against one wall. "I had Mrs. Henderson from town come out and stock the room with things a woman would need. She tried to guess at your size but said you could exchange anything that does not fit. I will send her up to help you change and get settled." "Who is Mrs. Henderson?" Caroline asked, confused. "The doctor's wife. She has agreed to stay here tonight and tomorrow to help look after you and make sure your fever does not return. I am not leaving your care to chance." Vincent moved to the fire, adding another log. "The doctor himself will come by in the morning to examine you." "That is not necessary," Caroline protested. "You have already done so much. I cannot expect you to hire people to nurse me." Vincent turned to look at her, his expression serious. "You are going to be my wife. Your health and well-being are absolutely my concern." "Please do not argue about this, Caroline. You are ill and you need proper care. Let me provide it." The firmness in his voice left no room for argument, and truthfully Caroline was too tired to fight. She nodded, sinking back against the pillows, and Vincent's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Henderson will bring up dinner shortly. Try to eat something even if you do not feel hungry. You need to keep your strength up." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the frame. "I am glad you are here safely. Get some rest." Then he was gone, and Caroline was alone in a room that was clearly meant to be hers, in a house that would soon be her home, about to marry a man she had known for only a few days, but who had already shown her more care and consideration than anyone had in years. She felt tears prick at her eyes, a confusing mixture of exhaustion and relief, and something else she could not quite name. Mrs. Henderson turned out to be a plump, cheerful woman in her 40s with graying hair, and a no-nonsense manner that reminded Caroline of the cook she had worked with in Boston. She helped Caroline change into a soft flannel nightgown, clucking over how thin she was and how the fever had clearly taken a toll, then brought up a tray with beef stew and fresh bread that smelled like heaven. "Vincent has been preparing for your arrival for weeks, Mrs. Henderson said as she set the tray on Caroline's lap. "He had this room cleaned top to bottom and bought all new linens for the bed. Asked my advice on what a woman would need, and then bought twice as much as I suggested. I think he was worried about you arriving and finding the place too rough." Caroline looked around the room with new eyes, seeing evidence of Vincent's preparations. The curtains at the window were new, the fabric still crisp. The wardrobe and dresser had been recently polished. There were rag rugs on the floor that looked freshly made, and someone had placed a vase of dried wildflowers on the dresser, adding a touch of beauty to the practical space. "He seems like a good man," Caroline said softly. "He is one of the best." Mrs. Henderson sat in a chair near the fire, pulling out some knitting. "Lost his father young and had to take over the ranch when he was barely more than a boy. Could have become hard and bitter, but instead, he became strong and steady. Everyone in the valley respects him. You are lucky to be marrying him, if you do not mind me saying so. I am beginning to realize that." Caroline took a spoonful of stew, and the warmth and richness of it made her realize how hungry she was. She ate slowly, feeling strength seeping back into her body with each bite. Over the next 3 days, Caroline remained in that bedroom, recovering under the watchful care of Mrs. Henderson and the doctor, a serious man named Dr. Phillips, who confirmed that she had indeed developed pneumonia, but that the worst seemed to have passed. He prescribed rest and nourishing food and warned her against trying to do too much too soon. Vincent visited several times a day, always polite and concerned, asking about her health and whether she needed anything. He brought her books from his small collection, thinking she might be bored lying in bed all day. He brought her wildflowers he had found in a sheltered spot where the snow had not completely buried them, presenting them with an awkwardness that Caroline found endearing. He told her about the ranch work, about Charlie and the other hired man, a quiet older fellow named Samuel, about the cattle and the challenges of winter feeding. Caroline found herself looking forward to these visits, to the sound of Vincent's voice and the calm competence he radiated. She learned that he read more than most frontier ranchers, that he had opinions on politics and poetry, that he could talk about everything from cattle breeding to the best way to preserve vegetables for winter. He was intelligent and thoughtful, and the more she learned about him, the more she felt drawn to him. But there was also a reserve in his manner, a careful distance that he maintained even as he showed her such care. He never touched her beyond the impersonal gestures of checking for fever or helping her sit up to take medicine. He never spoke of their coming marriage or what their life together might be like. It was as though he had placed her in a category marked patient or responsibility, and would not allow himself to think of her as anything else. Caroline wondered if he regretted his decision to send for a bride, if her arrival sick and weak had shown him that he had made a mistake. The thought troubled her more than it should have. She had expected a practical arrangement, a marriage of convenience that would give her security and him a helpmate. She had not expected to care so much about what he thought of her, about whether he might ever see her as more than a burden he had acquired. On the fourth day, Dr. Phillips pronounced her well enough to leave the bedroom, though he cautioned her to take things slowly and rest frequently. Mrs. Henderson helped her dress in one of the simple calico dresses that had been provided, dark blue with tiny white flowers, and braided her hair in a simple style. When Caroline looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser, she was shocked at how thin and pale she looked, her cheekbones too prominent and shadows under her eyes that spoke of her recent illness. "You will get your color back once you are eating regular and getting fresh air," Mrs. Henderson assured her. "You have good bones. You will be quite pretty once you are healthy again." Caroline was not sure she believed that, but she appreciated the kindness. Mrs. Henderson helped her downstairs, hovering in case she felt faint, but Caroline managed the stairs without incident. The main room of the house was revealed in full daylight coming through large windows, a space that was masculine but not uncomfortable, with sturdy furniture and a huge fireplace that dominated one wall. There was a kitchen area at one end with a good stove and a long table, and Caroline could see through an open door what looked like Vincent's study or office. Vincent was standing at the kitchen table, sorting through papers, and he looked up when he heard them on the stairs. Something crossed his face, an expression that was gone too quickly for Caroline to read, and then he was crossing the room to her. "How do you feel?" he asked, studying her face with that careful attention she had come to expect from him. "Much better. Weak still, but better." Caroline managed a smile. "It is good to be out of that bed. Come, sit by the fire. You should not overdo it on your first day up." Vincent guided her to a chair near the hearth, and Mrs. Henderson brought a blanket to tuck around her legs. "I need to be getting back to town," Mrs. Henderson said, gathering her things. "But I will check in tomorrow if that is all right with you, Vincent." "I appreciate everything you have done," Vincent said, walking her to the door. "Send me a bill for your time." "Nonsense. You helped my husband through that difficult time last year without charging him a penny. We are square." Mrs. Henderson patted Vincent's arm, then turned to wave at Caroline. "You take care now, dear, and do not let this stubborn man work himself to death. He needs someone to look after him as much as you need looking after." Then she was gone, and Caroline and Vincent were alone in the house together for the first time. The silence stretched between them, not quite uncomfortable but weighted with awareness. Caroline searched for something to say and finally settled on, "You have a lovely home. It is solid and functional. I have never thought of it as lovely." Vincent remained standing, his hands in his pockets, looking uncertain in a way she had not seen before. "I am not sure what to do with you now that you are recovered." The words came out awkwardly, and Caroline blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Vincent sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "I mean that you came here to marry me, but the circumstances have been unusual, to say the least. You have been sick, and I have been caring for you, and we have barely had a chance to speak as two people considering marriage. I do not want you to feel obligated to go through with this if you have changed your mind. If you wish to return east, I will arrange for your passage and ensure you have money to start fresh. You do not owe me anything." Caroline stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "Do you want me to leave?" "That is not what I said." Vincent's jaw tightened with frustration. "I am trying to give you a choice. You did not sign on to marry and invalid yourself to a man you barely know in a place far from everything familiar. If you have doubts, I would understand." "Do you have doubts?" Caroline asked quietly. Vincent was silent for a long moment, his blue eyes fixed on her face. "I have doubts about many things," he finally said, "but not about wanting you to stay. However, what I want is not the only consideration here." Caroline felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she had not fully realized she was carrying. "I do not want to leave," she said firmly. "I came here to build a new life, and that is what I intend to do. Unless you are saying you do not want to marry me after all, in which case I would appreciate you being direct about it." A slow smile crossed Vincent's face, transforming his serious expression into something warmer and more approachable. "I am saying no such thing. I am merely trying to be honorable and not pressure you into a decision you might regret. Consider me unpressured and decided." Caroline returned his smile. "Now, can we please discuss the practical arrangements? When did you want to have the wedding? And what needs to be done around here? I am not going to sit by the fire doing nothing while you work yourself ragged." Vincent's smile widened into something that might almost be called a grin. "Mrs. Henderson was right. You are exactly what I need." They spent the rest of that day talking, really talking about their expectations and their pasts, and what they wanted from their marriage. Caroline learned that Vincent's mother had died when he was very young, that he had few memories of her, but had been raised by his father to be self-sufficient and honorable. She learned that he had never been in love, had never really had time for courting with all the demands of the ranch. She learned that he valued honesty above almost everything else, that he could not abide lies or manipulation. In turn, she told him about her own childhood, about losing her mother to consumption and her father to drink a year later, about the years in the boarding house where she had worked from dawn to well past dusk for barely enough to survive. She told him about the landlord who had grown increasingly inappropriate in his attention, about the fear that had driven her to look for any escape, even one as drastic as becoming a mail-order bride to a stranger in Utah territory. "He never actually touched you, did he?" Vincent asked, his voice hard. "No, but he made it clear he intended to, and I was running out of ways to avoid him." Caroline looked down at her hands. "I know it must seem cowardly, running away instead of confronting the problem. It seems smart." Vincent's voice had lost its hardness, becoming gentle again. "You recognized danger and removed yourself from it. That takes courage, not cowardice. And I am glad you did, because it brought you here." The words warmed Caroline more than the fire could. "So am I," she said quietly. "Even with the blizzard and the fever and everything else, I am glad I came." They decided to wait another week before the wedding, giving Caroline time to fully regain her strength and allowing them to get to know each other better. Vincent made it clear that once they were married, he expected a real partnership, that he would value her opinions and contributions to the ranch. Caroline, in turn, made it clear that she was not afraid of hard work and that she wanted to be useful, not decorative. The week that followed was one of the strangest and best of Caroline's life. She continued to recover, growing stronger each day under a regimen of good food and moderate exercise. Vincent taught her about the ranch, walking her around the property when the weather was clear, showing her the cattle and the outbuildings and the layout of the land. She met Charlie and Samuel, both of whom were polite and welcoming, clearly pleased that Vincent would no longer be alone. She also began to take over some of the household tasks that Vincent had been managing himself or simply neglecting. The kitchen became her domain, and she took satisfaction in preparing proper meals instead of the simple fare that Vincent had been living on. She organized the pantry and made lists of supplies they would need from town. She cleaned and mended and began to make the house feel more like a home, and through it all, she and Vincent talked. They talked over breakfast and dinner, during walks and while sitting by the fire in the evening. They talked about everything and nothing, building a foundation of understanding and respect that Caroline had not dared hope for. She learned his moods, learned when he needed silence and when he welcomed conversation. She learned that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her by surprise with its wit, that he was endlessly patient with animals but had little tolerance for human foolishness. She also learned that she was falling in love with him, really and truly in love in a way she had never experienced before. It crept up on her gradually, in small moments like when he came in from the cold with snow in his hair and his cheeks reddened by wind, looking so alive and real that it made her heart ache. Or when he read aloud to her in the evening, his voice low and pleasant, stumbling slightly over unfamiliar words but determined to share the stories with her. Or when he looked at her across the table and smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his serious face into something beautiful. She did not know if Vincent felt the same way. He was clearly comfortable with her, clearly pleased with how she had settled into ranch life, but he maintained a physical distance that never quite broke. He never tried to kiss her or even hold her hand beyond helping her over rough ground. She told herself it was because he was being respectful, giving her time to adjust, but she worried that perhaps he simply did not feel the kind of attraction she was beginning to feel for him. The wedding took place on a clear, cold morning with the sun shining brilliantly off the snow. The Mormon bishop who served the Circleville community was willing to perform the ceremony even though neither Caroline nor Vincent belonged to his church, and a small group of neighbors gathered in the main room of the ranch house to witness the vows. Mrs. Henderson had helped Caroline make a dress from fabric that Vincent had ordered from Salt Lake City, a soft gray wool with white lace at the collar and cuffs. She felt beautiful in it, more beautiful than she ever had in her life, and when Vincent saw her coming down the stairs, something flared in his eyes that made her breath catch. The ceremony was simple and brief. The bishop's words about commitment and partnership, and the challenges of building a life together in this hard land. When Vincent spoke his vows, his voice was steady and clear, his blue eyes fixed on Caroline's face with an intensity that made her feel like she was the only person in the world. When it was her turn, she spoke her own vows with equal clarity, meaning every word about honoring and cherishing and standing beside him through whatever came. And then the bishop was pronouncing them husband and wife, and Vincent was leaning down to kiss her, a brief, chaste press of his lips against hers that somehow managed to convey both promise and restraint. The small gathering applauded, and Mrs. Henderson wiped away tears, and Caroline felt a joy so profound it was almost frightening. There was a celebration afterward, simple but cheerful, with food that Caroline had prepared with Mrs. Henderson's help, and cider that one of the neighbors had brought. People told stories about Vincent, about his father before him, about the early days of Circleville, when it had been nothing but a handful of determined families trying to survive in an unforgiving land. Caroline listened and smiled and accepted congratulations, feeling embraced by this small community in a way she had never felt embraced by the crowded boarding house in Boston. As evening fell, the neighbors began to leave, offering final good wishes and reminders that they were nearby if the newly married couple needed anything. Mrs. Henderson gave Caroline a meaningful look and whispered, "Be patient with him," before she departed, leaving Caroline more confused than enlightened. And then she and Vincent were alone, husband and wife, standing in the main room of the house that was now legally and completely their shared home. Vincent looked at her, something uncertain in his expression, and said, "I should bank the fire and check the stock one more time before bed." "All right," Caroline said, not sure what else to say. She was acutely aware that this was their wedding night, that there were expectations and traditions around that. But Vincent seemed determined to focus on mundane tasks. He left, and Caroline cleaned up the last of the celebration mess, stacking dishes and storing leftover food, trying to ignore the nervous flutter in her stomach. When Vincent returned, stamping snow from his boots, she had finished the kitchen and was standing by the fire, unsure what to do next. "Caroline," Vincent said, and there was something in his voice that made her turn to face him. He stood just inside the door, his hat in his hands, looking more uncertain than she had ever seen him. "I need to say something before we go upstairs." "All right." Caroline's heart was beating too fast. Vincent crossed the room until he stood a few feet from her, close enough that she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes. "I want you to know that I do not expect anything from you tonight, or any night, until you are ready. I know this marriage started under unusual circumstances, and I know you did not have much choice in the matter of whether to go through with it. I want you to feel safe here, to know that I will never pressure you or force you into anything. We can take as much time as you need to become comfortable with the physical aspects of marriage." Caroline stared at him, a dozen different emotions warring in her chest. Relief that he was not going to demand his rights as a husband, confusion about what he wanted. And underneath it all, a growing frustration because she was realizing that Vincent's careful distance was not about lack of attraction but about an almost excessive concern for her well-being. "What if I am ready?" she asked quietly. Vincent blinked, clearly surprised. "I am sorry, what?" Caroline took a breath, gathering her courage. "What if I am ready? What if I want my marriage to be real in all ways?" Vincent's expression shifted, something hungry and yearning breaking through his careful control before he pushed it back. "Caroline, you have been sick. You have been through a trauma. I do not want you to feel obligated." "I do not feel obligated." Caroline stepped closer to him, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "I feel married, to a man who has been nothing but kind and honorable and good to me. To a man who held me through fever and promised I would be safe. To a man I am falling in love with, if you want to know the truth." The last words came out in a rush, hanging in the air between them. Vincent went very still, his eyes locked on her face. "Say that again," he said, his voice rough. "I am falling in love with you." Caroline said it more firmly this time, claiming the truth of it. "I do not know if you feel the same way, and I understand if you do not, but I wanted you to know. I wanted you to understand that I did not marry you out of desperation or obligation. I married you because I wanted to, because in the week we have spent together, I have seen the kind of man you are, and I want to build a life with you." Vincent closed the distance between them in one step, his hands coming up to frame her face with a gentleness that belied the intensity in his eyes. "I am already in love with you," he said, the words coming out fierce and certain. "I have been falling since that moment in the way station when you told me who you were, and I realized that the woman I had been trying to save was the woman I had been waiting for. But I was afraid to tell you, afraid to pressure you when you had so few options." "I have options," Caroline said firmly. "You gave them to me. You told me I could leave if I wanted. I chose to stay. I chose you." "Caroline," Vincent breathed her name like a prayer, and then he was kissing her, really kissing her with a passion that had been held in check for too long. Caroline kissed him back, her arms winding around his neck, her body pressing against his as though trying to prove that she was here and real and his. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Vincent rested his forehead against hers. "Are you sure?" he asked one more time, giving her every chance to change her mind. "I am sure," Caroline said, and she was. She was more sure of this than she had been of anything in her entire life. Vincent swept her up into his arms just as he had that first day in Circleville. But this time, there was nothing impersonal about the gesture. He carried her up the stairs to the bedroom that was now theirs, the room where she had recovered under his care, and laid her gently on the bed. The fire was burning low, casting warm shadows across the walls, and outside the window, stars blazed in the cold winter sky. What followed was tender and slow, Vincent determined to make sure Caroline felt cherished and safe. Caroline equally determined to show him that she wanted this, wanted him, wanted the intimacy and connection of a true marriage. There was awkwardness, because they were new to each other. But there was also laughter and patience and a growing joy as they learned each other's bodies and discovered the pleasure they could bring each other. Afterward, Caroline lay wrapped in Vincent's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. She felt changed in some fundamental way, as though she had finally found the place where she belonged. "I was so afraid I would disappoint you," Vincent said quietly into the darkness. "I am not a smooth talker or a romantic. I did not know how to court you properly." "You held me through a fever," Caroline reminded him. "You stayed awake all night to keep me safe. You gave me choices and respected my decisions. That is more romantic than any pretty words could be." Vincent's arms tightened around her. "I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. You already are." Caroline tilted her head up to kiss his jaw. "But I will not stop you from trying." She felt his chest move with silent laughter, and she smiled against his skin, content in a way she had never imagined possible. The winter passed slowly, the deep snows of December and January giving way to the slightly lighter cold of February, and then the first hints of spring in March. Caroline settled fully into her role as Vincent's wife and partner, learning the rhythms of ranch life and making her own contributions. She took over the garden planning, ordering seeds from Salt Lake City, and preparing the plot behind the house for spring planting. She learned to help with the cattle, overcoming her initial fear of the large animals to become competent at feeding and basic care. She kept the books for the ranch, her neat handwriting and head for figures bringing order to what had been Vincent's somewhat haphazard record-keeping. But more than the practical contributions, Caroline brought warmth and life to the ranch house. She sang while she worked, filling the rooms with music that Vincent admitted he had not realized he missed until he heard it. She read aloud in the evenings, everything from newspapers to novels, her voice giving him a reason to stop working and simply be present. She talked with Charlie and Samuel, learning their stories and making them feel valued and seen. She attended the occasional social gathering in Circleville, making friends among the neighbor women and slowly becoming part of the community. And through it all, her love for Vincent deepened and matured, growing from the first intense attraction into something more solid and enduring. She learned his tells, the way his jaw tightened when he was worried, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he was genuinely amused, the way he stood a little taller when he was proud of something. She learned how to soothe him when he was frustrated, how to give him space when he needed it, how to draw him out when he was being too stoic for his own good. Vincent, in turn, seemed to bloom under Caroline's care and attention. He smiled more, laughed more, talked more freely about his thoughts and feelings. He became more affectionate, reaching for her hand as they walked, pulling her into his arms for no reason except that he wanted to hold her, kissing her with a frequency that suggested he still could not quite believe she was real and his. He told her he loved her daily, the words that had come so hard at first now flowing easily, and Caroline never tired of hearing them. In April, Caroline realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to be sure before telling Vincent. She chose a morning when spring had truly arrived, when the snow had melted except in the highest peaks, and the valley was beginning to green with new growth. They were sitting at breakfast, Vincent reading a letter from a cattle buyer while Caroline poured coffee, and she simply said, "I am going to have a baby." Vincent looked up from the letter, his expression blank with surprise for a moment, and then joy broke across his face like sunrise. "A baby," he repeated, as though he needed confirmation. "A baby." Caroline smiled, her hand moving unconsciously to her still flat stomach. "Probably in late October or early November, the doctor thinks." Vincent was out of his chair and around the table in seconds, pulling Caroline to her feet and into his arms, holding her so tightly she had to laugh and protest that he was squeezing her. "I am going to be a father," he said, wonder in his voice. "We are going to have a child. We are." Caroline pulled back just enough to see his face, to see the pure, uncomplicated happiness there. "Are you pleased?" Pleased does not begin to cover it. Vincent cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "I did not think I could be happier than I already was, but you continue to prove me wrong. I love you so much, Caroline. Thank you for this gift. I love you too." Caroline rose on her toes to kiss him, putting into the gesture all the joy and gratitude and hope she felt for their future. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, Caroline blooming with health in a way that made Vincent occasionally wonder aloud if she had ever really been the pale, fevered woman he had held through that terrible storm. She continued to work around the ranch with some modifications, Vincent becoming increasingly protective as her belly swelled and making her promise to avoid any heavy lifting or dangerous tasks. She sewed baby clothes and prepared a nursery in one of the upstairs bedrooms, painting the walls a soft yellow and hanging curtains she had made from cheerful fabric. She read books on infant care and talked with Mrs. Henderson and the other women in town, gathering advice and wisdom. In November, after a labor that was long but not complicated, Caroline gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Matthew Thomas Irving, Matthew for Vincent's father and Thomas for Caroline's. He had Vincent's blue eyes and Caroline's dark hair, and from the moment he drew his first breath and let out an indignant wail, he had both of his parents completely devoted to him. Vincent proved to be a natural father, patient and gentle with the baby in a way that made Caroline fall in love with him all over again. He would walk the floor with Matthew for hours when the baby was fussy, singing off key lullabies that somehow worked when nothing else would. He changed diapers without complaint and got up for nighttime feedings, bringing the baby to Caroline and staying awake to keep her company while she nursed. He built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it smooth and carving Matthew's name into the headboard with careful precision. The first year of Matthew's life was exhausting and wonderful, filled with sleepless nights and the constant demands of caring for an infant, but also with moments of such profound joy that Caroline sometimes felt her heart might burst with it. Matthew's first smile, directed at Vincent as he bent over the cradle making silly faces. Matthew's first laugh, a gurgling sound of pure delight when Caroline tickled his feet. Matthew's first steps, taken on wobbly legs across the kitchen floor to reach his father who was crouched with open arms and an expression of fierce pride. As Matthew grew from infant to toddler, Caroline and Vincent fell into a rhythm as parents and partners, supporting each other through the challenges and celebrating the victories together. They worked side by side on the ranch, which continued to prosper under their combined management. They made improvements to the house and the outbuildings, expanding the barn and adding a proper hen house that became Caroline's particular pride. They saved money with an eye toward Matthew's future, wanting to ensure he would have opportunities they had not had. When Matthew was 2, Caroline became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth. Sarah for no one in particular, but simply because they loved the name. Sarah had Caroline's green eyes and Vincent's dark hair, and she proved to be a calmer baby than her brother, content to observe the world around her with solemn attention. The years that followed were full and busy, the kind of years that pass quickly because they are filled with purpose and meaning. Matthew grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who followed his father everywhere, absorbing lessons about ranching and animals and what it meant to be a good man. Sarah grew into a bright, curious girl who asked endless questions and had opinions about everything. The ranch continued to thrive, Vincent's reputation as a fair dealer and skilled rancher spreading throughout the territory. Caroline became a pillar of the small Circleville community, organizing social events and helping newcomers settle in. Her own experience as a mail-order bride making her sympathetic to others who were trying to build new lives in a harsh land. Through it all, Caroline and Vincent's love for each other only deepened. They had their disagreements, moments of frustration or misunderstanding, but they had learned how to talk through problems and how to forgive each other's failings. They made time for each other, even amid the demands of children and ranch work, stolen moments of intimacy and connection that kept their marriage strong. They built traditions and memories, anniversaries celebrated with simple but heartfelt gifts, Sundays when they would take the children on walks through the valley and tell them stories about the land and their family. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Vincent surprised Caroline by taking her back to the way station where they had sheltered from the blizzard. It had been maintained over the years as an emergency shelter, and with some advanced planning, Vincent had arranged for them to spend a night there alone, Charlie and Samuel taking care of the children and the ranch. They arrived in the afternoon, the November day cold but clear, so different from that terrible storm a decade earlier. Vincent had brought supplies to make the small building comfortable, including food and wine and extra blankets. He built a fire in the same fireplace where he had kept vigil over Caroline's fever, and they sat together wrapped in each other's arms, talking about how far they had come. "You ever regret it?" Vincent asked quietly, "answering that advertisement and coming west?" Caroline looked up at him, seeing gray threading through his dark hair now, lines around his eyes that came from years of squinting into the sun, but also seeing the man who had held her through fever and promised forever. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "This life we have built, this family, this love. It is everything I ever wanted and more than I dared dream of. What about you? Do you regret sending for a mail-order bride? I regret that letter I sent telling you to wait until spring, the one that never reached you. Vincent's arms tightened around her. If it had, you might not have come when you did, and I might not have been on that stage to help when you needed it. As much as I hate that you suffered through that fever, I cannot regret the circumstances that brought us together. We might have found each other anyway, Caroline suggested. Perhaps fate wanted us together and would have found a way. Perhaps. Vincent turned her in his arms so he could look directly into her face. But I prefer to think that we chose each other, and that choice is what makes our love so strong. You chose to come west despite the dangers. You chose to stay when I offered you a way out. You chose me, again and again, and I have tried every day to be worthy of that choice. And I chose you, Caroline said, her voice thick with emotion. Every single day I choose you. I will keep choosing you for the rest of our lives. Vincent kissed her then, deep and long and full of all the love they had built over 10 years of marriage. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Caroline laughed and pulled him closer. "Make love to me," she whispered against his ear. "Here where it all began." Vincent did, with a passion and tenderness that had only grown over the years. And afterward, they lay tangled together near the fire, content and complete. They stayed at the way station through the night, talking and making love and simply being together without the demands that usually filled their days. In the morning, they rode back to the ranch, to their children and their life, both grateful for the past and excited for the future. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges and joys. Matthew grew into a fine young man who took on more and more responsibility for the ranch, showing a natural aptitude for the work and a character that made both his parents proud. Sarah grew into a strong-willed young woman who wanted to be a teacher, a dream that Caroline and Vincent supported by ensuring she had access to all the education available in their small community and beyond. When Caroline was 42 and Vincent was 46, their children both grown and making their own ways in the world, they found themselves alone in the ranch house for the first time in nearly 20 years. It was strange at first, the quiet and the lack of demands on their attention, but it was also liberating. They rediscovered each other in some ways, remembering what it had been like when it was just the two of them. They took to riding out together across the ranch land in the evenings, watching the sun set over the mountains and talking about everything and nothing. They traveled occasionally, something they had rarely done when the children were young, visiting Salt Lake City, and even making a trip back east so Caroline could show Vincent where she had come from. They worked in the garden together and cooked meals together and spent long winter evenings reading aloud to each other just as they had in those early days of their marriage. And through it all, their love remained the constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They had weathered storms both literal and metaphorical, had faced challenges and celebrated triumphs, had raised children and built a legacy. But at the core of it all was the choice they had made that snowy November day when Vincent had held a fevered woman and promised her safety, when Caroline had looked at a stranger and decided to trust him. On their 25th anniversary, Vincent took Caroline back to the way station one more time. They were older now, their bodies showing the effects of years of hard work and frontier living, but their love had not diminished. If anything, it had grown stronger, tempered by time and tested by life. They stood together outside the small building, looking at the place where their story had truly begun, and Vincent said quietly, "I thank God for that blizzard. I thank God for every circumstance that brought you to me. Even the fever," Caroline asked with a slight smile. even the fever. Vincent pulled her close. Because it gave me the chance to show you who I was, to prove that you could rely on me. And it gave you the chance to show me your strength and courage. We became partners in that storm, Caroline, and we have been partners ever since. And we will continue to be, Caroline said firmly, for as long as we both shall live. And perhaps beyond, Vincent added. I cannot imagine heaven would be heaven without you there. They went inside, built a fire one more time, and spent the night wrapped in each other's arms. Two people who had started as strangers and become everything to each other. Two souls joined by chance and choice, and a love that had endured for 25 years, and would endure for however many more they were granted. Years later, when they were both gray-haired and moving more slowly but still deeply in love, they would sit on the porch of the ranch house they had built together and watch their grandchildren playing in the yard. Matthew had married and brought his wife to live on the ranch, taking over most of the daily operations while Vincent served as advisor and occasional helper. Sarah had indeed become a teacher, but she had returned to Circleville to open a school, marrying a carpenter and settling nearby so she could remain close to family. On one such evening, with the sun painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Caroline leaned against Vincent's shoulder and said, "We did all right, did we not?" Vincent looked at the thriving ranch, at the children and grandchildren who bore their names and their values, at the woman beside him who had been his partner and love for more than 30 years. "We did better than all right," he said firmly. "We built something beautiful." "Yes," Caroline agreed softly. "Yes, we did." When Vincent passed away at the age of 72, peacefully in his sleep after a full and well-lived life, Caroline mourned deeply but without regrets. They had had 36 years together, years filled with more love and joy than most people experienced in twice the time. She continued to live on the ranch, cared for by Matthew and his family, an honored matriarch who told stories about the old days and the blizzard that had changed her life. She lived to be 76, her mind sharp until the end, and when her time came, she passed away as peacefully as Vincent had in the bedroom they had shared for so many years. Her last words were reported to be, "I am coming, my love. Wait for me." They were buried side by side in the small Circleville cemetery, their headstones simple but clear about what mattered most. Vincent Thomas Irving, beloved husband and father, and Caroline Vaughn Irving, beloved wife and mother. And between the dates, the years that marked their lives, was the truth that anyone who had known them could attest to. They had loved each other truly and completely, from that first snowstorm through fever and forever. Their story became a legend in the valley, told and retold to new generations. The story of the mail-order bride who fell sick in the snow, and the cowboy who held her through the fever and loved her forever. It was a story about choice and courage, about the unexpected ways that love can find us, about the power of commitment and partnership. It was a story that reminded people that the best things in life are worth fighting for, worth holding onto through storms and sickness, and all the challenges that life brings. And it was a story that proved, beyond any doubt, that sometimes the most practical arrangements can become the most passionate love stories, and that forever is not just a promise but a choice made new each day, held fast through fever and snow and all the years that follow, until death itself becomes not an ending but merely a pause before the story continues in whatever comes next.